So I hope you've had a couple days after listening to the first four, hopefully fairly short lectures, to sort of process the information, come up with questions, maybe ask some of those questions, get some answers, be confused about things, struggle with the information a little bit. So I wanted to just sort of go over and review all the things I talked about in the previous four lectures. So starting with the learning objectives, of course, the definitions of the different terms, using anatomical position as a baseline, defining this descriptive terminology between the structure and location of structures and relationships between structures. So hopefully you got to try some of those motions in your own body and get that get the idea of that. Describing the planes and axes for common joint motion based on anatomical position. Describing three different arthrokinematic motions, which those are the joint surface motions, and the convex concave rules that apply to normal joint surface motion. Applying base of support and center of gravity to the principles of stability. Hopefully you didn't have to knock any books off shelves to learn that one, but hey, if that's what it takes. Describing three classes of biomechanical levers, examples of those, and explaining their advantages and disadvantages to human muscle function. Identifying the components of biomechanical levers and describing how torque and levers affect movement. And open and closed chain activities and passive and active movement. So we'll just review that and sort of, hopefully you've had a couple days to chew on it and maybe forget some of it, and we'll just go over it again because repetition is a good way to learn. So the types of movement, rotation and translation. Rotation is movement of body about an axis. Translation is all parts of the body in the same direction. So translation, of course, includes curvilinear, which is a curved path, and rectilinear, which is a straight path. So this guy in the picture is running. He's translating in a straight path. So he has translation going, rectilinear motion, but he also has rotation motion, the axis of rotation around the joints. That's propelling him in that translation. So we usually have two types of movement going on at once. So the planes of motion are the cardinal planes that divide the body into halves. Sagittal plane, left and right division, frontal plane, front and back division, and horizontal or transverse plane, top and bottom division. And all those three planes intersect at our center of gravity. So the degrees of freedom are the number of planes of motion that a joint allows. The glenohumeral joint is 3 axes, 3 planes of motion, rotation, flexion, extension, abduction. And just to make it fun, we have horizontal abduction as well. So each joint, and we'll talk about in the joint chapter coming up, how many degrees of freedom each joint has. So common osteokinematic movements in the different planes. Sagittal plane, flexion and extension, dorsiflexion and plantar flexion in the ankle, and forward and backward bending, which is trunk flexion, forward bending, and trunk extension, backward bending. And the frontal plane, you almost can't not do these motions when you're describing them. So feel free to do the motions. Abduction, that's your classic jumping jack. Lateral flexion or side bending of your trunk or your neck. Ulnar and radial deviation, ulnar towards the pinky, radial towards the thumb. That's of the wrist only. And inversion and eversion. Inversion of the ankle and foot complex is the plantar surface or the sole of the foot towards the midline, and eversion is sole of the foot away from the midline. In the horizontal plane, we get internal and external rotation or medial and lateral rotation of whatever joints do that, and axial rotation, so rotation of our head, rotation of our trunk. So the axes of rotation, remember these are the axes that run perpendicular to the planes. So an anterior posterior, so you can take your pen or pencil or knitting needle. An anterior posterior axis runs straight through the frontal plane. So it is the axis for frontal plane motion, like ab and adduction. A medial lateral axis runs through the sagittal plane. And so it is the axis for sagittal plane motion, flexion and extension. And a vertical or longitudinal axis runs through the horizontal or transverse plane, and that is the axis for rotational movements, like trunk rotation. So hopefully those are starting to make sense to you. This is sort of like plane man in the other diagram, but this one includes the axes. So this is the sagittal plane, and the medial lateral axis runs perpendicular to it. The transverse or horizontal plane, the vertical or longitudinal axis runs perpendicular to it, and the frontal plane, the anterior posterior axis runs perpendicular to it. So our two perspectives of joint movement, open chain and closed chain movement. So open chain is the movement of a distal segment of bone about a relatively fixed proximal segment. The closed chain motion is movement of proximal segment about a relatively fixed distal segment. So when you think about it, with closed chain motions, either your hands or your feet have to be on the floor, so the proximal part of your body can move. I have some examples of open chain movements. So this guy doing an overhead press, that's an open chain movement for the upper extremity. The proximal section of the body is fixed and the distal section is moving. The knee extension, that's another example of an open chain movement. Proximal section is fixed and the distal section is moving. So a push-up, that's a great example of a closed chain motion, and it's closed chain for both the upper extremities and the lower extremities. So the distal segment is fixed and the proximal segment is moving. The squat, always a favorite, classic functional squat. Closed chain, the proximal segment is moving and the distal segment is fixed. In this, we've got open and closed chain movements alternating. So we start out on the feet with closed chain on and closed chain on the feet and open chain on the hands. And then when you put the hands to the ground, your closed chain upper extremity lifts the legs up, your open chain lower extremity. So whatever's touching the ground, if it's the distal segment, that's closed chain. If the proximal segment is moving, that's closed chain. If distal segments are moving and the proximal is fixed, that's open chain. So fun stuff, right? You could probably take any movement and tell me whether it's open chain or closed chain. So arthrokinematics are the movements between the joint surfaces. So we always, or most of the time, have convex surface moving on a concave surface or concave moving on convex. The three fundamental movements are roll, slide, and spin. Roll is multiple points moving along an articulating surface, contacting multiple points on another articulating surface. So that's the tire rotating across the stretch of pavement. Slide is a single point on one, sliding across multiple points on the other. That's the skid on the ice. The spin is one point on one articular surface rotating on a single point of another. That's like the ballerina on point rotating around, doing a pirouette or a toe top spinning on the floor. Roll and slide mechanics, it's our convex concave rules. So get your skeletal model or piece of clay or whatever you're going to use. When the convex joint surface moves on the concave joint surface, roll and slide occur in opposite directions, so it doesn't roll and then slide right off. It rolls and then has to slide in the opposite direction to maintain joint congruency. Concave on convex, the concave is moving, the convex is stationary. Roll and slide occurs in the same direction. Okay, so play with some bones. or whatever you want to use for models. You can use your hands. You can say, this is the concave surface, this is the convex surface. What's happening? This is moving versus this is moving. So you don't need bones, you can use your hands. Kinetics, of course, is the effect of forces on the body. So a force is a push or pull that can produce, modify, or halt a movement, like muscle force or gravity. Internal force is generated within the body, and it's usually provided by muscles. External force is generated outside the body, and it's usually provided by gravity. So concurrent forces are forces that act together and pull in a different direction. So I have the picture of the jar because we have one force, the thumb force is going in one direction and the finger force is going the other direction to produce torque. So sometimes in the body we have muscles, some muscles pulling in one direction and other muscles pulling in another direction to produce a rotational movement to produce torque. A lot of times in the body, we call those force couples when two forces act in an equal but opposite direction and it results in a turning effect. So the unscrewing the jar lid is a force couple between the thumb and the fingers. Upward and downward rotation of the scapula, which we'll talk more about in the shoulder chapter, use muscles in a force couple to produce that rotational movement. So the muscles are moving in opposite directions to produce a rotational movement. So torque is our rotational force. The amount of torque generated across a joint depends on the amount of force exerted, so the amount of gravity acting on the body or the amount of muscle, and the distance between the force and the axis of rotation. So that distance is called the moment arm. Internal torques are usually muscles generated inside the body. External torques are generally gravity or somebody else moving you. They're generated outside the body. So the ability of force, torque is basically the ability of force to produce rotation around an axis. It's rotary force. The amount of torque a lever has depends on the amount of force and the distance from the axis. So if you have a longer lever, you can exert more force, or if you use more force, you can exert more force. So we use a fulcrum, or we use a pry bar to open up a can of paint because we have a longer level and we can use less effort to produce more force. So it was Archimedes that said if you give him something to stand on and a long enough lever, he could move the earth. So he's going to stand on the fulcrum and he has his lever to move the earth. So the greater the moment arm, the greater the torque, the greater the lever. So as a muscle contracts through its range of motion, the amount of angular and stabilizing force will change. So you'll notice that through a range of motion, some areas of the range of motion will be stronger, some will be weaker. And when we start talking about muscles in chapter 3, we'll talk about that length tension relationship between the muscle length and the amount of tension it can generate. So hopefully that makes sense. So when we compare moment arms of different muscles, so I sort of skipped this in the kinetics lecture because I thought it wasn't time for it yet. I thought you needed time to process the information a little bit before we talked about it. So now hopefully you've had time to process. So the biceps has a shorter moment arm because it attaches more proximally on the radius. The brachialis has a longer moment arm because it attaches more distally on the radius. So the brachioradialis can actually generate more force, but what's gained in force is lost in distance of movement. So the brachioradialis is most functional in a really short range of motion, about 15 degrees, but it can really generate a lot of force. The biceps can't generate as much force, but it can generate a lot more movement. So the longer moment arm creates greater force. So using mechanical principles of levers can make work easier. So it's the idea of Archimedes moving the earth or prying the lid off a paint can, however you want to think of it. So all levers contain a force, which is either the internal or external moment arm, a weight or resistance, which is the other one, and a fulcrum or an axis. So in the human body, the force that causes the lever to move is usually muscular. The axis or the fulcrum is the fixed point about which the lever rotates, which is the joint. So in the body, our joints are the axes. The first class lever, the axis is between the force and resistance. So the force of the of gravity pulling the head down and the resistance of the muscles in the back of the neck pulling the head up. And the axis is in the middle. It's designed for balance. So the axis is C1, cervical vertebrae, vertebra 1. The resistance is the weight of the head, and the force is the muscles on the opposite side. So that's our first class lever. You could say it the other way too. You could say the force is gravity pulling the head down, and the resistance is the muscle holding the head up. So they're interchangeable in the case of a first class lever. The second class lever, the axis is opposite the force and the resistance is in the middle. So the wheelbarrow is the example. And it's designed for power. So that's our brachioradialis, designed for power, not for distance of movement. So our action of the plantar flexors when we go up on our tiptoes or do a heel raise, the metatarsophalangeal joints in the foot are the axis or the fulcrum. The resistance is the weight of the tibia and the rest of your body above that. And the force is the plantar flexors pulling up. So the force and the axis are on either side, and the resistance is in the middle. Third class lever, axis is opposite the resistance, and the force is in the middle. So the non-human example is the screen door with the spring. The human example is the biceps curl, designed for range of motion. The axis is the elbow joint, the resistance is the weight in the hand, and the force is the biceps pulling up on the proximal radius. So the axis is opposite the resistance and the force is in the middle. So I think of them as the first class lever is FAR, force, axis, resistance, FAR. The second class lever is ARF, ARF, axis, resistance, force. And the third class lever is AFR, axis, force, resistance. Okay, I have a stupid story to tell. I won't tell it on the recording. I'll tell it in the office hours. If you want to hear it. Stupid mnemonic for remembering it. So FAR, ARF, and AFR. If you want to think of it that way. The factors that change lever class are the direction of movement in relation to gravity is another factor that can affect lever class. So the biceps is a third class lever when it's contracting concentrically with axis, force, and resistance. It's a second class lever when contracting eccentrically because the external force becomes the force and the biceps becomes the resistance to the movement. So you have ARF instead of AFR. So so when the biceps is contracting concentrically, we are going for motion. When it's contracting eccentrically, we're going for power to control the descent of that weight going down. So it changes lever class when we change gravity as the force or muscle as the resistance, or muscle as the force and gravity as the resistance. So the line of pull describes the direction of muscular force, and it depends on what the relationship of the muscle to the axis. So in a medial lateral axis, which is sagittal plane movements, if the muscle is anterior to the axis, you get flexion. If it's posterior to the axis, you get extension. With an anterior posterior axis, which is perpendicular to the frontal plane, ab and adduction, a lateral muscle pulls the bone laterally, a medial muscle pulls the bone medially. So vectors represent magnitude and a direction of force. So force couples have some, you can talk about vector relationships in force couples. With regard to stability, we have to have our center of gravity, the point at which all weight is equal on all sides. Our center of gravity has to be within our base of support. The line of gravity is that imaginary vertical line passing through the center of gravity towards the center of the earth. So if your line of gravity goes outside of your base of support, you're going to fall over unless you change your base of support. And the way we change our base of support to regain balance is to step out. That's how we change our base of support. Or maybe we're going to use a cane, or maybe we're going to use a walker. But if our center of gravity is closer to our base of support, it's going to be easier to maintain balance. If our center of gravity is closer to the center of our base of support, it's going to be easier to maintain balance. So the example of the book, when the center of gravity is in the middle of the base of support, it's most stable. When it's less stable at the edge of the base of support, and it's unstable when the center of gravity is outside of the base of support. So hopefully, just this little review was helpful in sort of pulling some things together. If you still find them confusing, let me know and we'll discuss them.